Harlan was 43 years old and looked 60 on one side of his face and 30 on the other, depending on which way the light caught him. He had a jaw like the edge of a hatchet and eyes the same color as the dirt around a dry creek bed, that dull, particular brown that people mistake for simple until they look too long and realize there's something underneath it that doesn't move, doesn't flinch, and doesn't forget. He'd been in Cielo Rojo for 11 years. Long enough that the town had stopped watching him the way it watches a stranger. Long enough that the liveryman knew which horse was his without being told, and the woman who ran the boarding house kept his room at the end of the hall with the window that faced south because he'd told her once, just once, that he slept better facing south, and she'd never given that room to anyone else. He was not a famous man. He'd been, once, in a narrow and unpleasant way, the kind of famous that comes not from doing something remarkable but from surviving something most men don't. There had been a time, in another county, under another name that nobody in Cielo Rojo knew to ask about, when Harlan Cross had been the kind of man that other men stepped around on the street. Not from respect. From the particular calculation that lives in the back of a man's eyes when he looks at someone and does the arithmetic on whether today is a good day to find out. It never was, with Harlan. Nobody had ever found a good day. But that was before. Before the 11 years. Before the room facing south. Before the liveryman learned his horse. The 11 years had been deliberate in a way that people who saw them from the outside could not fully appreciate, because the outside of them looked perfectly ordinary. A man living quietly in a small town, doing modest work, keeping to himself without being unfriendly, playing cards on Thursdays, drinking coffee in the mornings. Nothing in the surface of it advertised the effort underneath. But it was effort, real effort, the sustained kind, the kind you can't let up on or it finds its way back. He had made a decision about what kind of man he was going to be, and he had made it once, and then he had made it every subsequent day, and the accumulation of those daily remakings was what people on the outside saw as 11 unremarkable years in Cielo Rojo. He had learned to value ordinary things in proportion to their actual worth, which is higher than people who have always had them understand. The hot coffee in the cold morning. The Thursday card game. The fence line in good repair. The specific, recognizable weight of being somewhere that knows your name without apprehension. These were not small things. He knew they were not small things because he knew what their absence felt like, and the absence was very large. He was eating breakfast at the long table in Dora Peasley's boarding house when the door opened and the boy came in. The boy was 17, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter for anything except legal purposes. His name was Clem Tasker, and he had his father's nose and his mother's unfortunate coloring, that reddish, thin-skinned kind that burned in summer and went gray-white in cold weather and never settled into anything comfortable in between. He was not a large boy. He was the kind of boy who had grown up knowing he was not large and had compensated in the ways available to him, quickness, mostly, and a particular stubbornness that his mother called determination when she was feeling generous and pig-headedness when she was not. He wore his hat pushed back on his head the way young men do when they want to look casual and only succeed in looking like they're trying to look casual. He stood in Dora Peasley's doorway with his hat pushed back and his face doing something complicated. Harlan looked up from his eggs. "Mr. Cross," the boy said. "Clem. I need to talk to you." Harlan looked at the boy's face and then at the rest of him and then back at the face. He took a long drink of his coffee. It was good coffee. Dora Peasley made good coffee, and it was one of the small, reliable things about his mornings that he'd come to count on without ever quite naming it to himself as counting on it. "Sit down then," he said. The boy sat down across from him. He put his hat on the table and then picked it back up and held it in his lap. He looked at Harlan's eggs and then at the window and then at the floor beside his own boots. "You know about my father," the boy said. Harlan said, "I know what I know. He went to see Doc Finnick yesterday." Doc Finnick told him. The boy stopped. He turned his hat around once in his hands. "He's got maybe a month. Maybe 6 weeks if the weather stays cool." Harlan set down his fork. He did not say he was sorry. He'd found, over the years, that saying you were sorry about something you couldn't change was one of the small dishonesties people were so committed to that pointing it out caused more hurt than the dishonesty itself, and so he'd stopped pointing it out and mostly he just didn't say it. He believed in being honest inside the limits of what was kind. He told me something, Clem said. Before he went to bed last night, he told me something. All right. He told me about the Alderman brothers. The room didn't change. The light through Dora Peasley's windows was the same pale light it had been. The coffee was still sitting where Harlan had set it. But something shifted in the air between the two of them, the way air shifts before weather, not dramatically but certainly. Harlan picked up his coffee again. What did he tell you? He told me what happened in Gila Fork. 12 years ago. The boy looked at him directly then. Young eyes. That particular young man's look that thinks directness is the same as courage. He told me what they did to your brother. Harlan drank his coffee. He told me you let it go, Clem said. He said you made yourself let it go. He said it was the hardest thing he ever saw a man do, and he'd been watching you do it for 11 years, and he said, the boy's voice caught slightly. He pressed his lips together and waited until it uncaught. He said when he was gone, there wasn't going to be anybody left who knew where you'd come from and why you'd stayed, and he wanted me to know, because he said you'd been the best friend he had and the best man he knew, and he didn't want me to. Clem. He didn't want me to be surprised, the boy finished. When you. Clem. Harlan's voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet the way a low fire is quiet, banked down but nowhere near out. Stop there. The boy stopped. He turned his hat in his lap. Your father is a good man, Harlan said. He's the best man I have known in this life or near enough that the margin doesn't matter. And I am sorry, he paused on the word, noting to himself that he was using it, deciding it was right to use it here. I am genuinely sorry that he is sick. Are you going to go to Gila Fork? The boy asked. Harlan looked at him for a long moment. You should go home, he said. Be with your father. The boy looked at him with those young, direct eyes. Are you? He said again. Harlan stood up and put on his hat and walked out into the pale morning. The Alderman brothers. He had not spoken those words aloud in 11 years. He had thought them, sometimes, in the long middle part of the night when the room facing south was dark and the town was quiet and the particular arithmetic of everything he'd put away tried to present itself for review. He'd learned to put it away again. Had become, over 11 years, genuinely practiced at it. Some men are defeated by what they carry. Harlan had decided, a long time ago, that he would not be. It was one of the few decisions he had ever made entirely on principle, with nothing to support it but his own word to himself, and he had kept it. His brother's name had been Robert. Rob. For years younger, which meant that when Harlan was 17 and big and angry and the thing that other men calculated with their eyes, Rob had been 13 and small and easy and the thing that small, easy boys are, which is to say, a target. Harlan had spent 4 years of his adolescence ensuring that no one in Colfax County thought Rob was a suitable target, and it had worked, mostly. And then they'd grown up and gone their own ways and Harlan had ended up in the life he ended up in and Rob had gotten himself a piece of land outside Gila Fork and a wife named Cecily and a daughter named May and a second daughter coming. That was where it had been when the Alderman brothers found him. The Alderman brothers were not famous men either, in the way that Harlan wasn't. They were the smaller kind of terrible, the kind that operates below the threshold of legend, grinding people down not through spectacle but through persistence. There were 3 of them, Dav, who was eldest and did the thinking, Cutter, who was the middle and did the damage, and a younger one they called Pip who was 17 and had not quite yet decided which direction his life was going to go. The trouble with Rob Cross had been about a land dispute, technically, in the way that trouble with the Alderman brothers was always about something technical. They were the kind of men who understood that a legal claim is harder to fight than a personal grievance, and so they always worked to transform the personal into the legal before anyone understood what was happening. Dav Alderman had the intelligence of a man who has never used it for anything good. He had a quality of surface respectability, decent suit, careful speech, the kind of manner that makes people in authority give him the benefit of the doubt before they've done the arithmetic, and behind it a perfect willingness to hurt people if it served his ends. He had never done the hurting himself. That was Cutter. DAV provided the direction and the cover and the legal scaffolding, and Cutter provided what Cutter provided, and between them they had worked their way across several counties taking pieces of things from people who were not in a position to keep them. Rob's land had been one such piece. The claim DAV filed was technically coherent. He had found a man willing to swear to a surveying error from 15 years prior, and in the time it would take for Rob to contest it, the intent was to make the land not worth contesting. That was how it worked with the aldermans. You didn't end up with nothing because they took everything at once. You ended up with nothing because they made everything cost more to hold than you could afford to pay. Rob had refused to be made that way. That was the thing about Rob that Harlan had always known and had perhaps not thought about enough until it was too late to matter in any useful sense. Rob had that particular kind of quiet stubbornness that looks harmless and is not. He did not fight back loudly or visibly. He simply did not move. He stayed. He kept working. He kept filing his own paperwork and showing up at every required proceeding and being unpersuadable and present. He had, Harlan thought, more genuine courage than Harlan himself had ever had, the slow kind, the kind that requires not one dramatic act but years of ordinary resistance, every day, without the satisfaction of being seen doing it. Cutter had done what Cutter did because Rob would not be moved by anything else. By the time Harlan had heard about it and ridden to Gila Fork, there was nothing left to fix. Cutter Alderman had been the one who did it, on a Tuesday in October, in the yard outside Rob's house, while Cecily watched from the window with one daughter in her arms and the other not yet born, and the particular helplessness of windows. Harlan had arrived 2 days later. What happened in the following week was not something he could look at straight, even now. He could look at pieces of it. He could look at Cecily's face, which had that quality of someone who has passed through a door they can't come back through. He could look at the grave, which was in the corner of Rob's land by the 2 juniper trees that Rob had liked because of the way they smelled in the morning. He could look at May, who was 6 and didn't completely understand and so kept asking about her father in the particular, circling way of children who have been told something they can't hold. He could not look directly at what he'd wanted to do. He'd known where the Alderman brothers were. He'd known exactly what he was capable of. He'd sat with that knowledge for 3 days in the room that Cecily had given him, and he'd felt it the way you feel a fire you're sitting next to in winter, the particular, complicated relationship between something that could destroy you and something you need. And then Roy Tasker had come. Roy Tasker was not yet his friend then. He was Cecily's neighbor, a solid, quiet man with a wife and a baby boy and a piece of land that adjoined hers and a reputation in Gila Fork as someone who could be counted on in the way that the creek could be counted on. Reliable, present, not particularly exciting, essential. He had come to the room Cecily had given Harlan and he had sat in the chair by the window and he had looked at Harlan with the particular directness of a man who was not afraid of what he was looking at. "I know what you're thinking," Roy had said. Harlan had not answered. "And you may be thinking you're the only man in this county with a reason to want that done," Roy said. "But I want you to hear me when I tell you that you're not. What Cutter Alderman did to your brother, he's done to others. Not the same way, but the same kind. And there are men in this county who have been waiting and building and collecting evidence, and there is a circuit judge coming in the spring who is not owned by anyone, and if you go do what you're thinking about doing, you will have satisfied yourself and you will have burned everything else to the ground, and DAV Alderman will spend the next 10 years painting you as a murderous gunman and himself as the wrong party, and Cecily and that little girl and whatever comes next will spend the rest of their lives under the shadow of that story." Harlan had looked at him. "I am not telling you it isn't your right," Roy had said. "I am not telling you it isn't deserved. I am telling you the cost." The silence between them had been very long. "The circuit judge," Harlan had said finally, "spring. Comes through Gila Fork regular. He has integrity. And you think?" "I think DAV Alderman is going to prison by summer if you don't burn it down first," Roy said. And Cutter with him. I think Cecily gets to live in a story that ends with justice and not with her brother-in-law turning himself into the kind of man that did the thing she'll have to explain to May. Harlan had sat with that for a long time. The younger one, he'd said. Pip. He wasn't there. I know he wasn't there. Roy had looked at him steadily. He's 17, Harlan said. Yes. So was I once, Harlan said. When I was 17, I was deciding. He had looked at the window. The juniper trees at the corner of the property were just visible from where he sat. All right, he'd said. He'd stayed for the spring. He'd been there when the circuit judge came through, and he'd stood in the room and given his testimony with a steadiness that came not from indifference but from having made a choice and committed to it. And he'd watched D.A.V. Alderman's face go through the particular stages of a man realizing that the narrative he had constructed was failing. Cutter had gotten 12 years. D.A.V. had gotten 8 on the conspiracy side of it. Pip had been there in the room and had watched it and had walked out with the look of someone who has seen a door open onto a different kind of life. And then Harlan had left Gila Fork and come to Cielo Rojo and stayed. Roy Tasker had come 2 years later, with his wife and his boy Clem, and had bought the edge piece of land outside of town that adjoined the creek, and he had never said a word about Gila Fork to anyone, and neither had Harlan, and that was how a friendship is built sometimes, not through what you say to each other but through what you are equally committed to not saying. It was 3 days after his breakfast with Clem that Roy Tasker sent for him. Harlan had spent those 3 days doing what he usually did, which was not very much, and deliberately. He did the small repairs on the fence line of the property the Meacham family rented him. He played cards on Thursday night at the Occidental Hotel with the 3 men he played cards with on Thursday nights. He ate Dora Peasley's cooking and drank her coffee and slept in the room facing south. He did not go to the telegraph office. He did not ask anyone about Gila Fork. But he had known, in the way that you know things you are trying not to know, that Cutter Alderman had been released. He had known it for 4 months. Someone passing through town had mentioned it in the general, conversational way of passing travelers, and Harlan had heard it and put it in the locked room in the back of his mind and turned the key and told himself it had nothing to do with him anymore. He had made his choice 12 years ago. He had kept it. He was not the man he used to be, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that went looking. But there is a difference between being a man who has put away a thing and being a man for whom the thing no longer exists. He walked out to Roy Tasker's land in the late afternoon when the light had gone golden and the heat had backed off to the kind that is merely warm. Roy's wife, Clara, met him at the door. She was a thin woman with capable hands and eyes that had seen more than they'd been asked to see in the last month, and she looked at Harlan for a moment before she stepped aside and let him in without saying anything, which told him more than words would have. Roy was in the back room, in the narrow bed that Clara had moved him to when the stairs became too much. He was thinner than the last time Harlan had seen him, 2 weeks ago, maybe, not long, thinner in the way that is about more than just weight, the way the substance of a man begins to move back from his edges and concentrate itself somewhere deeper. But his eyes were still Roy's eyes. Clear and steady, and doing that thing they'd always done, which was look at what was actually there instead of what was easier to look at. "Sit down, Har," Roy said. Harlan sat in the chair beside the bed. For a while neither of them said anything. Outside, in the direction of the creek, a bird was doing something persistent and repetitive and without apparent urgency. The late light came through the one small window and lay across Roy's blanket in a bar of gold. "I hear the boy talk to you," Roy said. "He did. I told him more than I should have." "You told him what you thought he needed to know," Harlan said. "That's the same as what you've always done." Roy's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. The gesture a smile makes when it doesn't have quite enough energy to complete itself. "Cutter Alderman's in Gila Fork," Roy said. Harlan said, "I know." The 2 words sat in the room between them. Roy looked at them, you might have said, turning them over. "He came back to his brother's old claim," Roy said. "D.A.V. died in prison 2 years ago. Pip, I don't know about Pip. Nobody seems to know. But Cutter came back, and he's been there 6 months, and nobody's done anything about it because there's nothing legal to do, and he walks around Gila Fork like a man who has paid for his debt and intends everyone to acknowledge it. And Cecily? Harlan said. Roy was quiet for a moment. She's still there. Stays on the land. May's 20 now, and there's a husband and a boy of her own. Cecily's healthy. He paused. She doesn't go into town much. Harlan looked at the bar of light on the blanket. He sees her, sometimes, Roy said. In town, when she has to be there. He tips his hat at her. They say he tips his hat. The bird outside continued its repetitive, indecipherable business. What are you asking me, Roy? Harlan said. I'm not asking you anything. Then what are you telling me? Roy looked at him for a long time. His breathing was the careful, shallow kind that comes when deep breaths cost something. I'm telling you what is true, he said. I'm not telling you what to do with it. All right. You know I never told you what to do. I know. 12 years ago I told you the cost, Roy said. I didn't tell you what to choose. I know that too. You made the right choice, Roy said. I know. The judge was good. The trial was fair. Cutter served 12 years. I know all of that, Roy. Another silence. The light had moved slightly, the bar of it narrower now as the sun declined. I'm going to die, Roy said, with the particular flatness of a man who has been looking at that fact long enough that it's lost most of its drama. Before I do, I wanted to tell you myself. About Cutter being back. Not have you hear it some other way. Harlan nodded. Because you're going to do whatever you're going to do, Roy said. And I can't tell you not to, because I don't have the standing for that, and I don't know that it would be right to anyway. But I wanted it to come from me. What's true? Not from a rumor. I appreciate that, Harlan said. And he did. It was the kind of thing Roy Tasker did, the kind of care that looked like information giving but was actually something much older and harder to name. He sat with Roy for another hour, and they talked about other things, the fence line, the Thursday card game, the new family that had moved into the Hendricks place. Roy asked about Dora Peasley's coffee with the particular hunger of a man who has been told he is not to have coffee anymore, and Harlan described it in deliberate, unhurried detail, and Roy's eyes did that almost smile thing again. When Clara came to the door, Harlan stood and put on his hat. Harlan, Roy said. He turned. Roy was looking at him with the clear eyes. I'm glad you stayed, he said. These 11 years. I'm glad you stayed here. Harlan held his hat in both hands. He looked at Roy Tasker, this man who had sat in a room in Gila Fork 12 years ago and told him the truth without flinching, who had come 2 years later to the same small town and never asked for acknowledgement, who had been the kind of friend that doesn't announce itself, the kind that is just continuously, reliably present in the way that water is present. So am I, Harlan said. He meant it completely. He went back to his room and he sat on the edge of his bed for a long time in the dark. There was a lamp on the table by the window, but he didn't light it. He sat in the dark and he did the thing that he had practiced for 11 years. He looked at what was true without flinching from it and without dressing it up in anything other than what it was. What was true, Cutter Alderman had served 12 years for what he did. What was true, the law had worked, and the way the law works when it works, which is imperfectly but genuinely. What was true, Harlan had made a choice in a room in Gila Fork, and he had kept it, and in keeping it he had become something he had not been before, not softer, but different. He had put away the part of himself that went looking. He had discovered, slowly and with genuine surprise, that there were things he liked about the man who had replaced that part. The Thursday card games. Dora Peasley's coffee. The fence line. The room facing south. What was true, Cutter Alderman tipped his hat at Cecily Cross in the streets of Gila Fork. He sat with that for a long time. There is a particular quality to an injustice that has been legally addressed but not genuinely resolved. It is not the same as an injustice that has been ignored. In some ways it is harder, because all the channels through which outrage normally moves have been formally satisfied, the trial, the prison time, the debt acknowledged, and yet the substance of the thing, the weight of it, the particular way it sits in the chest, has not changed. The law had taken Cutter Alderman and put him in a cage for 12 years, and now it had released him, and there was nothing further the law could do, and Cutter Alderman walked around Gila Fork tipping his hat, and Cecily Cross did not go into town much. That was what was true. He thought about Rob. He didn't do this often, had learned, over the years, to keep it behind a door that he controlled, but tonight he let himself. Rob at 13, small and easy. Rob at 26, which was how old he'd been, with the land and Cecily and May and the second one coming. The way Rob used to talk about the juniper trees and how they smelled in the morning. How he'd written Harlan a letter once that said, in the way that younger brothers sometimes find the words for things that older brothers can't, that he was proud of Harlan for being the kind of man Harlan was, whatever that meant exactly, because Rob had only seen pieces of it and didn't know the whole picture. Harlan had kept that letter for years and then lost it somewhere between one place and the next, and he thought about it sometimes. He thought about May, who was 20 now, with a husband and a boy of her own. He thought about Pip Alderman, who had been 17 in that courtroom and had watched his brothers go to prison with the look of someone seeing a door open onto a different kind of life. He sat in the dark for a long time. Then he got up and he went to the corner of the room where he kept certain things in a particular arrangement, a battered trunk, a bedroll, things that traveled well. He stood looking at them for a while with his hands at his sides. Then he went back to the bed and lay down and looked at the ceiling and waited for morning. Clem Tasker came to him the next day at noon. Harlan was at the livery, doing a small repair to his saddle that he'd been meaning to do for 2 weeks. He heard the boy coming before he saw him, the particular quality of fast footsteps that don't quite know whether they're running. He kept his eyes on the saddle. "I know you're going," the boy said. Harlan pulled the stitch through. "Clem." "I know. Papa told me, not everything, but enough. About what Cutter Alderman did." The boy's voice was carrying something in it, some freight that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief and lived somewhere in the complicated country between the two. "And I know where Gila Fork is, and I know you weren't planning to go there on a social visit." Harlan set down the saddle work. He turned and looked at the boy. Clem Tasker was standing in the entrance to the livery with the afternoon light behind him and his hat in his hand and his face doing something that Harlan recognized without any pleasure of recognition. He'd seen that face on his own, in mirrors and in windows, at various points in his life. It was the face of someone who is about to say something they know will cost them the saying, but who has decided it has to be said. "I'm asking you not to go," Clem said. Harlan was quiet. "Not because of the law," the boy said. "Not because Cutter served his time or any of that. I know what he did. I know what he did to your brother." He stopped for a moment and his jaw tightened the way young jaws do when young men are keeping something controlled. "I know what he deserves." "Then what are you asking me?" Harlan said. "I'm asking you because of my father." The boy's voice had gone to something lower and more careful. "Because my father is in that bed and he's got maybe a month, and you are the best friend he has had in his life, and I have watched the way he looks when you come to visit, and I have watched what it does for him, and—" He stopped. "And if you go to Gila Fork and you do what you're thinking of doing, you may come back and you may not, and if you come back you'll come back different, and my father will know what you did and he will spend whatever time he has left carrying the weight of it because he is the kind of man who would feel responsible." "Clem." "He told you to let it go," the boy said, and his voice cracked on the last word in the way that young voices crack when what they're carrying gets heavier than their control of it. 12 years ago he told you to let it go and you did, and he told me that was the best thing he ever saw a man do, and if you go now and do it anyway, then all of that, all 11 years of it, all of him telling you it was right." His voice stopped entirely. He looked at Harlan with those direct young eyes. And then something in him gave way, in the way that things in young men give way when they have been carrying more than they can carry, and it didn't happen dramatically, it was very quiet, the kind of surrender that doesn't announce itself. He put one hand on the doorframe of the livery and he let his head come down and he said, in a voice that was barely voice at all, "Please. I'm begging you. Please don't go." Harlan stood very still. The livery was quiet around them, the one horse in the far stall shifting its weight, the smell of hay and old leather and the day's heat collected in the wooden walls. Outside, Cielo Rojo was doing what it always did at noon, going through its ordinary middle-of-the-day life, indifferent. "My father is dying," Clem said, still barely voice. "And you are the only person outside of family who I think he genuinely loves. And I do not want to watch him spend his last weeks knowing you went and did this thing. I do not want that to be part of how it ends for him." He looked up. His eyes were wet, not overflowing, just wet, the kind of wet that comes when a person is holding it back hard. "I am asking you. I am begging you. On my father's behalf and my own. Please." The quiet between them was very full. Harlan looked at this boy, Roy Tasker's son, who had his father's eyes and something of his father's particular kind of honesty, the kind that doesn't dress itself up or ask for credit. He looked at Clem Tasker standing in the entrance of the livery with his hat in his hand and his head held up, begging, which is the most costly thing a proud young man can do. He thought about Roy in his bed. The bar of light on the blanket. "I'm glad you stayed." He thought about the room facing south. He thought about Cutter Alderman tipping his hat on the streets of Gila Fork, and Cecily who didn't go into town much. He thought about Rob's letter that he had lost between one place and the next, and the juniper trees, and the smell they made in the morning. He thought about Pip Alderman, 17 years old in a courtroom, watching a door open onto a different kind of life. He thought about who he was now, and who he had been, and the distance between the two, and who built that distance, and with what kind of effort, and at what kind of cost. And he thought about what is owed to the dead. Not in the legal sense, he understood perfectly well that the law had discharged that, but in the older, quieter sense. The sense that has nothing to do with courts or circuits or the things that can be written down. The sense that lives in the part of a man that wakes up at 3 in the morning and will not be put back to sleep and simply stands in the dark and says, "This is still unfinished." He picked up the saddle work again. "Go home to your father," he said. "Harlan. Go home, Clem." His voice was quiet. Not cold. Not hard. Just settled, the way a thing is settled when it has been decided by something deeper than the deciding part of a man. Be with him. That's where you should be. The boy stared at him. "I'm not asking you to understand it," Harlan said, still looking at the saddle work. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to go home." The boy stood in the doorway for a long time. The light was behind him and Harlan could not see his face clearly, only the shape of him, young, and not large, and carrying more than he should have to carry. "I thought you were different," Clem said. His voice had gone flat and dry, the way voices do after they've spent what they had. "Papa always said you were different." "Your father is right," Harlan said. "I am different. That's why I have to go." The boy left. Harlan sat alone in the quiet livery for a long time after. He held the saddle work in his hands and did not do anything with it. The horse in the far stall shifted again and breathed the deep, uncomplicated breath of horses. Outside, Cielo Rojo continued its noon. He was gone before morning. He left Dora Peasley a month's rent in an envelope and a note that said he was uncertain how long he'd be away and thanked her for the coffee, which was and had always been exceptional. He left a second note with the liveryman regarding his horse's preferences. He left nothing else. He had never accumulated much, and what he had packed into his saddlebags without difficulty or sentiment. The ride to Gila Fork was 2 days through country that he knew and that knew him, or had known him, in the way that landscapes know the people who have moved through them, not personally, but with a kind of passive record-keeping, the way the marks of old trails stay in the ground long after the people who made them are gone. He rode without hurrying. The pale sky of Cielo Rojo gave way to the different pale sky of the in-between places, and then to the particular blue that sat over the Gila Fork basin on clear days like a borrowed piece of the above country. He thought about very little. He had made his decision in the dark of his room, and it didn't require additional thought. He had found, over the years, that decisions made in sufficient quiet and honesty tended to hold. They didn't need to be visited and revisited. They just needed to be carried forward. He thought, once, about Clem Tasker's face in the doorway of the livery. The wet eyes. The begging. He thought, I know. I know what this costs you. I know what it costs him. He thought, this is not about that. He rode on. He came into Gila Fork in the late afternoon of the second day, when the town was going through its early evening motions and the saloon up the main street was beginning to fill and the shopkeepers were closing their doors. He recognized the geography of the place without pleasure, the way returning to somewhere you left in pain presents you with its landmarks in a flat and unfeeling manner, as if the places themselves have no memory of why you left or at what cost. He knew where Cutter Alderman was. He had found out, methodically and without drama, through the same network of information that moves through the territories in the form of passing travelers and letters and the conversations of men who sit on porch steps and have long memories. Cutter had been living at his brother's old claim for 6 months, as Roy had said, doing what small-time men with no particular prospects do, a little work here, a little there, sustaining himself without purpose or direction, the way a fire sustains itself on whatever it finds. He didn't go to the claim that evening. He got a room at the single hotel Gila Fork possessed, a narrow establishment run by a woman with an impressive mustache who had the particular manner of someone who does not ask questions professionally. He ate at the hotel's small dining room, which was not bad. He slept better than he expected to. In the morning he shaved, which he did every morning, and this morning was the same as any other. He looked at his own face in the small mirror above the wash basin. 43 years old, and looking 60 on one side and 30 on the other. The hatchet jaw. The Dry Creek bed eyes that people mistook for simple. He thought about Roy Tasker in his bed, the bar of light on the blanket. I'm glad you stayed. He thought, so was I. He thought, it was real. It was 11 years of real. I am not undoing it. It stands. But this stands too, and the one does not cancel the other. He put on his hat and walked out. He found Cutter Alderman not at the old claim but on the main street of Gila Fork, which was perhaps predictable. Small-time men tend to gravitate toward the center of wherever they are, needing the audience, needing to feel accounted for. Cutter was at the far end of the street in front of the dry goods store, talking to no one in particular, or rather, talking to the kind of nobody that becomes an audience when it has no better option, which was a boy of about 12 who looked as if he wished he were somewhere else. Harlan stopped in the middle of the street. He had thought, over the years, when he thought about Cutter Alderman at all, that time would have done something to him, the way 12 years in prison does something to a man, whether it improves him or reduces him or merely compresses him into a harder version of what he'd already been. He had not expected the man he saw to look so ordinary. Cutter Alderman was perhaps 50 now, heavier than he'd been, with the look of a man who had aged not dramatically but just steadily, the way a fence post ages, gray around the temples, thick through the middle, fundamentally unchanged in the way that fundamentally unchanged things are. He was telling the boy something about horses, gesturing with one hand. The morning light lay on the street of Gila Fork in the same pale, uncommitted way it had laid on the street of Cielo Rojo that morning 11 years ago. Some light is like that, present without weighing in on anything. Harlan stood in the street. Cutter Alderman looked up and saw him. There is a moment, between recognition and response, that tells you nearly everything about a man. It is very brief, a second, perhaps two, but in that second the thing the man actually is becomes visible, uncurated, before the social instincts take back over. What Harlan saw in Cutter Alderman's face in that second was not guilt. It was not remorse. It was not fear, exactly. It was the look of a man who has concluded that a debt he personally believes he has discharged is being presented for collection again, and who resents the presentation. That was all it was. That look, in that second, was sufficient. Cutter said something to the boy that sent him off, a dismissal, practiced and casual. And he turned to face Harlan with his hands loose at his sides and a particular expression that was trying to be easy and only succeeding in being studied. "Don't know you," Cutter said. "No," Harlan said. "You wouldn't. You want something, mister. I'd appreciate you saying it." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what he had come to say. He had worked it out over 2 days of writing, in the quiet interior way of a man who takes his own thoughts seriously, and now the time had come to say it, and he said it. "My name is Harlan Cross," he said. Something moved in Cutter Alderman's face. Something that was not remorse and not guilt, but was something, a quick and voluntary acknowledgement of the weight of that name, the way a man acknowledges, briefly and despite himself, the weight of a thing he has put away and not adequately disposed of. "I served my time," Cutter said. His voice had gone tighter. "Not afraid. Something harder than afraid. I served every day of 12 years. There is nothing you can come to me with." "That's right," Harlan said. "You served your time. The law has nothing more to ask of you. And I have not come here for the law." Cutter's hands moved slightly at his sides. "I want you to know something," Harlan said. "I want you to know that I know what you did. Not in the legal sense. Not in the sense of testimony and evidence and the record that exists on paper somewhere. I mean that I know. I have known for 12 years. And I have thought about it for 12 years. And I have carried it for 12 years. And I want you to know that it has never, for a single day, been put to rest. Not by the trial and not by the sentence and not by the 12 years. I want you to know that there is a man standing in front of you who has known what you did to my brother every day for 12 years and has not forgotten it and will not." Cutter Alderman stared at him. "That's what I came to say," Harlan said. The street was quiet. A horse at the hitching rail 2 doors down shifted and its bit made a small sound. "I thought you came to," Cutter started, and then stopped. "I know what you thought," Harlan said. "I considered it. I considered it for 11 years, and I considered it on the ride here. I made my choice a long time ago, and I am here to honor it. But I will not honor it in silence. I will not let you walk these streets believing that what you did has been absorbed and settled and that the world has moved on without remainder. It has not. I am the remainder. I will be the remainder until one of us stops breathing. And you will know it. That is all." He let the word stand in the air between them. Cutter Alderman's face had gone through several things and arrived at somewhere that was not quite any one thing, not shame, not defiance, not the simple resentment of a moment ago. It was something more unresolved than any of those. Something that would not, Harlan judged, resolve itself easily or quickly. Good. He turned and walked back to the hotel. He did not look back. He was back in Cielo Rojo in 3 days. Dora Peasley took back his month's rent without comment and put the envelope he'd left on the hall table in her apron pocket and made him coffee, which was, as it had always been, exceptional. The room facing south was waiting with the same undemanding readiness of a room that is genuinely a room and not merely a place a person stops. He sat on the bed and looked at the wall for a while, and then he lay down and looked at the ceiling, and then he got up and washed his face and went to Roy Tasker's land. Clara let him in with the same look she'd given him when he'd come before, that look of a woman who has been through more than she was asked to be through and has found, somewhere on the other side of it, a kind of patient stillness. Roy was awake. He was thinner, even in 3 days, something had preceded. But his eyes were still his eyes. He looked at Harlan for a long moment after Harlan sat down. He didn't ask the question directly. He asked it the way Roy Tasker asked things, which was to look at the actual situation and let the silence do the asking. "I talked to him," Harlan said. "That's all." Roy's eyes did not move from his face. Reading it with the particular thoroughness of someone who knows a face well. "That's all," Harlan said again. The breath Roy let out was very slow and came from somewhere deep and had something in it that was not quite relief and was not quite grief and was, Harlan thought, mostly just the breath of a man who has reached the end of a particular tension and is now in whatever comes after. "I thought you came to," Roy started. "I know what you thought," Harlan said quietly. Same as Clem thought. Same as I thought, once. He looked at the blanket, at the place where the bar of light had been. But I went there to say his name to him. To say my brother's name to his face and let him know he is not forgiven. Not absolved. Not forgotten. That is what I went to do, and that is what I did. Roy was very still. He has to live with knowing I exist, Harlan said. That there is someone who carries it. Someone who will not let it become a thing that happened in past. That is what I could give my brother. That is what was left to give. The room was quiet for a long time. Clem told me you'd gone, Roy said. I know. Roy paused. He was pretty hard about it. He was right to be, Harlan said. He loves his father. Roy was quiet. I am not the man I used to be, Harlan said. You know that. You helped make me not that man. That is true and it stands. But Roy, he tips his hat at Cecily. He walks around down there like the books are balanced, like everything that happened was a transaction that got completed. And I could not let that be the only story. I could not let him not know that there is someone who carries it. I needed him to see my face and know my name and know that he is not forgiven. Not by me. Not in the way he wants to be forgiven, passively, by default, because enough time went by. Roy said, was it enough? Harlan looked at the bar of light on the blanket, which had moved since his last visit, different time of day, different angle, but was still there. It's all there is, Harlan said. So yes. It was enough. They sat together for a long time without speaking. Outside, the creek made its reliable sound and the bird that had been doing something persistent and repetitive was doing it again, or a different bird was doing the same thing, and the light moved slowly across the blanket in the way that light moves when you're watching it, almost imperceptibly, so that you keep thinking it hasn't moved and then at some point you look and it clearly has. I'm glad you came back, Roy said. Where else would I go? Roy almost smiled. He buried Roy Tasker on a Saturday, in the corner of his own land by the creek, which was what Roy had wanted and what Clara had decided and what seemed correct to everyone who knew him, that a man whose most important quality had been his reliable presence should be present, permanently, in the land he'd worked and the place he'd made. It was a small burial. The people who came were not numerous, but they were real, the kind of mourners who have actually lost something, which gives a burial a specific gravity that larger and more performative gatherings don't always achieve. Harlan stood at the back, not from discomfort but because he felt, on this occasion, that the front of things belonged to Clara and to Clem and to the small community of Roy's everyday life. The minister said what ministers say, and most of it was fine and some of it was exact. After, when the others had gone and Clara had gone inside and the afternoon had settled into itself, Clem came and stood beside Harlan at the grave. They stood there for a while. He talked about you, Clem said. More than you probably know. Harlan kept his eyes on the grave. He said you were the most honest man he'd met, Clem said. Not honest in the easy way. Honest in the way that costs something. He said those are different things and most people only have the easy kind. The creek made its sound. The afternoon was very still. He was right about you, Clem said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite forgiveness and was not quite acceptance and was not quite grief alone, but was something made from all three of those things mixed together in the particular proportions of a young man who is trying, honestly and with some difficulty, to see a thing clearly and not just to feel it. He was right about you in ways I'm still figuring out. Give it time, Harlan said. Yeah. They stood together at the grave. After a while, Harlan put his hand briefly on Clem's shoulder, not long, just a moment, the kind of touch that acknowledges something without trying to resolve it, and then he put on his hat and walked back across Roy Tasker's land toward the road to town. The sky was the same pale it had been on the morning all this started. No color in particular. Not promising anything. Just present, just watching, in the way that skies watch, without judgment and without comfort and without looking away. He walked back to his room. He spent the days after the burial doing what he usually did. There is something clarifying, he had found, in returning to ordinary things after an extraordinary season. The fence line needed work, it always needed something, which was part of its value. He ate his meals at Dora Peasley's long table. He went to bed in the room facing south. He got up in the mornings, and the mornings were the same mornings they had always been, pale and uncommitted and belonging equally to whatever you brought to them. He thought about going back to see Clara, and then he thought about what Clara needed, which was not more visitors and not more people needing things from her. And so he stayed away for a week, and then he sent word through Clem that he was there if she needed anything practical, and Clara sent back a thank you that was brief and sincere. And that was the right amount of contact for that moment, in the way that the right amount of a thing is always recognizable when you're paying attention. He thought about Gila Fork. He thought about the main street and the pale morning light and the specific look on Cutter Alderman's face in that second between recognition and response. He thought about it the way you think about a thing you've done that you can't undo and wouldn't undo and are still processing the weight of, not with regret, but with a kind of steady acknowledgement. It sat in him. It would always sit in him. That was not a problem. Some things are supposed to sit in you. Some things being present is not the same as some things being wrong. He had not drawn on Cutter Alderman. He had not threatened him. He had not touched him. He had done exactly what he told Roy he'd done, talked to him, told him the truth, walked away. And yet he understood, sitting with it now, that it had not been a small thing. Standing in that street, saying that name, his own name, his brother's name, the name of what happened, was not small. It had cost something. Not in the legal sense, not in any sense that the world would measure or record. But in the interior sense, in the place where things actually happen, it had been as large as anything he'd done in 11 years. He thought about Clem. Not with guilt, he had done what he believed was necessary and he stood by that, but with something more like careful attention. The boy was going to be all right. He had Roy's foundation under him, and a foundation like Roy Tasker's does not disappear with the man. It gets transmitted, the way important things get transmitted, not through instruction or formal legacy but through the long proximity of someone who embodies a thing, so that eventually the thing lives in you without you being able to name the exact moment it took up residence. Clem had lived with Roy Tasker for 17 years. He had been shown, every day of those 17 years, what it looked like to be honest, to be steady, to do the right thing even when it was expensive, to be present when presence was required and quiet when quiet was required. That did not vanish. It would be with Clem for the rest of his life, shaping him in ways he would sometimes recognize and sometimes not, and that was Roy's real inheritance, and it was considerable. He would not be easy with Harlan for a while. That was all right. Hard feelings between people who have both behaved from honest conviction are not the same as ruptures. They are more like the soreness after a hard physical day, real, present, not permanent. He thought, on the other side of some amount of time, that Clem Tasker might become someone he was glad to know. There was a particular kind of relationship that could grow between a man in his 40s and a young man of 17 when both of them had loved the same person and had each lost him and had each needed to do the thing they needed to do even when it cost the other something. It was not easy. But it was real. He thought about Clara Tasker, who would go on being who she was, capable and quiet and under-remarked upon in the way that capable and quiet women are often under-remarked upon, and who would manage the land and manage the grief and manage Clem and do all of it without making a performance of it. He made a note to himself, the kind that doesn't require writing down, that he would find practical ways to be useful to her in the coming months. Not intrusive ways. Just present ones. He thought about Cecily Cross. He thought about sending her a letter and then thought about what that letter would say and decided it would say too much or too little and that both were wrong. He thought about going to Gila Fork again and then thought about what purpose that would serve. He thought about May's boy, who was growing up on Rob's land, and whether May ever told him about his grandfather, and what she said if she did. There is a particular silence that settles on a man who has done what he believed was right and knows that believing it was right does not make it clean, and knowing it is not clean does not make it wrong. It is not a peaceful silence, exactly. But it is a silence that can be inhabited. That can be lived in, the way a house can be lived in even when it has rooms you don't go into, rooms that you are aware of but that you have decided to leave as they are, because opening them again will not improve either you or the room. He had done what he'd gone to do. He had not done what Clem had feared he'd do and what, if he was honest with himself, he had gone 12 years having the capacity to do. He had stood in the street of Gila Fork and said his name to a man who had tried to forget that name, and he had put the truth into that man's face and walked away. It was not justice. Justice in the formal sense had already occurred and had been, in its formal sense, sufficient. This was something else. This was the refusal of erasure. This was the insistence that certain things be acknowledged in the present tense, by living people, face to face, without the mediation of courts or time or the comfortable distance of it all being over. He did not know if Cutter Alderman would be altered by it. He suspected not dramatically. Men of that particular type, the ones who look at their own ledgers and pronounce them settled, tend to be resistant to revision. But he also knew, because he had looked at Cutter's face in that second between recognition and response, and he had seen what was there, that it was not nothing. It was not nothing to be stood in front of. It was not nothing to be named. It was not nothing. He thought about Rob. He thought about the juniper trees and the letter he'd lost. He thought about May, who was 20 and had a boy of her own, which meant Rob had a grandson out there somewhere growing up on the land Rob had worked, and that was something, not enough, never enough, but something. The kind of something that you hold because there is nothing bigger to hold and it is real. He thought about Roy. He thought about the 11 years. The Thursday card games. The fence line. The room facing south. The particular, patient, unremarkable friendship of a man who had told him the truth when he needed it and then shown up in the same town 2 years later and never asked for credit and never required acknowledgement and just been there, reliably and continuously there, the way the creek was there. He thought about what Roy had said. "I'm glad you stayed." He sat in his room with the lamp burning and the window facing south, and he let himself be what he was, which was a man who had made his choices and was living with them, which is the condition of all men who have made choices and have the honesty to know it. He was not at peace, exactly. He was not at war. He was in the older, quieter condition that comes after both of those, the condition that has no name, that is simply what remains when the deciding is done and the doing is done and what is left is the living. He sat with it. Outside, Cielo Rojo went on being Cielo Rojo, the liveryman who knew his horse, Dora Peasley and her exceptional coffee, the pale sky that watched without committing to anything, the town that had stopped watching him the way it watches strangers. He was not famous here. He was not a legend or a gunman or a man with a story. He was just Harlan Cross, who had a room facing south and ate his breakfast at the long table and played cards on Thursdays and had been, it was now past tense, the best friend of Roy Tasker who was buried by the creek. That was enough. It was enough. He blew out the lamp. The dark was the same dark it always was. Not threatening. Not comforting. Just the dark, full of what the dark is always full of, everything that the day holds at arm's length, everything that lives most honestly in the quiet. He let it come. He lay in it with his eyes open and the window a lighter square of darkness against the dark of the room, and he breathed, and he did not put anything away. He let it all be true at once. In the morning, Dora Peasley would make coffee. He would drink it. He would go on.